Hello, guys and girls. The program you are about to hear will be both fun and educational, but it is not a substitute for medical advice. Although we are doctors, we are not your doctors. Hello, and welcome to Travel Medicine. As always, I'm your friendly neighborhood internal medicine doc, Dr. J.
Hey guys, Dr. Santhosh here, pediatric infectious disease doc, and sometime researcher.
Santosh, I'm still pretty pumped and riding high from Comic-Con.
Oh, yeah. As we record this, you have emerged from the cocoon of San Diego, having metamorphosed into a beautiful post con butterfly.
And while there are a lot of upsides, great cosplay, wonderful panels, even a few science oriented ones, there were also a few downsides, a few of which we discussed, but also another disease that you often see in crowded places. And it made me think
Mm,
we should go back to something we haven't visited in a while.
yes, syphilis. Let's go for it. Come on now.
No, no,
No,
you're on the right track in that
okay.
we are going to talk about a disease. But it's one that you don't mind shouting from the hilltops. And when I say shouting from the hilltops, of course I mean E. coli.
I don't know that I've ever heard E. coli put into a cough drop commercial like that before. Many different iterations on, how to play with E. coli, but that's a damn good pun. I don't know that I'll ever call it the same again. Like I might walk into my patient's room. Hey, your child has E. coli. Seriously, it's sepsis.
It's time for another one of our favorite long-running segments,
Mm.
Around the World in 80 Plagues.
Yay! Oh man, I'm climbing into my old timey Jules Verne like balloon so that we can start our 80 plagues journey. Absolutely, I'm so excited.
Before we set this balloon off in the air, I do have to mention this is a bit of a special episode because it's our first plague since we offered our limited edition ebook with a totally different plague.
Oh yeah.
So, if you're following the Indiana Jones dotted red line, we are progressing through cities and we are going to set our balloon in the same general direction and head to Strasbourg, Austria.
Oh, very beautiful. Yeah. So you tied this all together today because now we're in the mountains where there are like alpine horns and yodeling.
Young scientist who began his medical studies in Würzburg in 1876 and then continued them over several different centers, of which the first was Strasbourg. And I'm talking, of course, about what was his name? It was one of the chipmunks.
Alvin,
No,
Simon,
no,
Theodore.
that's the one.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, the smart one. Sure, of course.
I
Yeah,
thought he
yeah.
was the hungry one.
No, no, no. That's
Simon wore
Simon.
the glasses.
Yeah, Theodore. No, no,
Theodore
no.
wore green. Theodore wore green, and he was always sneaking cookies.
Real. Oh, no, I thought for sure Theodore wore the glasses when he was a smart one. Because as we know in a cartoon, if you wear glasses, you're the smart one.
I was about to say, Santos, you're putting a lot
No,
of pressure
no.
on people who have already proven defects in, at the very least, vision. So, after completing basic education and 6 months military service in Strasbourg, Escherich moved to Würzburg and then continued to Berlin, Munich, and Kiel.
And we'll bring Esserich around to our actual plague in just a little bit. Those of you who haven't made the connection yet, don't worry. We're going to tie it all together. Those of you who have, don't give it away.
Escherich became the first assistant studying under Professor Carl C.A.J. Gerhardt
Mhm.
who was an internal medicine physician
Okay.
at great hospital name, Juliuspital,
Yeah.
like an Orange Julius, but the hospital version,
Yeah. So named after, presumably like an emperor, right? Julius Patil kind of thing. Yeah. Uh-huh.
in Würzburg in 1882.
Mhm.
Now, here's where I would expect you'd be able to take over, Santosh, because during almost all of, or at least the first half of 1884, he was mentored in pediatrics and
Yeah.
the newly emerging science of your field, bacteriology.
Yeah, it's not my nearest and dearest field. I definitely in research I use E. coli. I'm a parasitologist. I study eukaryotic pathogens, but definitely when you put pediatrics and infections together, that's totally me. And we really look up to Dr. Esserich because putting all of this together under the tutelage of Gerhardt, we now have a field that we really thank these two gentlemen for, which is pediatric infectious diseases. Now, for a very long time, and even now still there's the folks were like, okay, this works in adults, this is what adult physiology and biochemistry and how the infections work in this population, so it should be the same but just smaller for for a child. But these folks started really looking into how different children were in terms of how they reacted to infectious diseases, how they should be treated, how they convalesced, everything about that pathophysiology. This was a unique field of study.
But you know how they have the saying, you have to get your hands dirty, and you always start in like kind of lowest position, sort of the
Yeah,
metaphorical mailroom equivalent.
sure. Okay. Is this going to be butt stuff? Are we going to?
Weird that that's the first place you go,
Well, okay.
but you're not wrong.
Yeah. When we were medical students, right? That was one of the first
Whoa,
things.
before you start casually tossing
No,
around.
yeah. No, it's true. It would be whatever, 9 o'clock at night at the end of a rotation or whatever. Have you finished all of your notes? And yeah, yes, we're good to go. Okay, I'm gonna have, oh, before you do that, Mr. Jones over in 265 needs a disimpaction. And guess who gets to do that? Yeah, yeah. It's a quintessential experience.
So, how did his mentor Gerhardt facilitate his interest in pediatric slash bacteriology? He says, I want you to go study with Rudolf Emmerich, well known scientist,
Yeah.
to Naples,
Okay.
all
Yeah.
expense paid. Well, some expense paid. Well, here's a plane ticket,
Well, no
train
planes.
ticket,
Train ticket. Yeah.
no trains, horse
Yeah.
ticket,
Sure. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Hmm.
and I want you to study the large cholera epidemic.
Yeah, yeah. Now, this was a really cool opportunity for him. Emmerich, really made advances in cholera, this horrible diarrheal disease. And interestingly enough, Josh, he was also the co inventor of one of the very first antibiotics before there were true antibiotics, which was piocyanase. So it was not an easy drug to take. It was horribly toxic and this kind of a thing. But in eminent fashion of microbiologists at the time, Emmerich had experimented on himself by injecting cholera and and proving that cholera transmitted person to person is less virulent than if you take it out of the ground. So yeah, he it was a great mentor for old Theodore. There was Rudolf Emmerich.
So he Theodore quickly became an expert at observing Vibrio cholera in fecal samples from affected individuals, many of who were children. He
Yes.
literally had to dig through child poop to make a name for himself. But he didn't limit himself to just the end results of the intestinal tract.
Okay. All right.
He moved to Munich after 2 years to
Okay.
obtain, and you'll appreciate this, the name of the postdoctoral qualification you get at
Mhm.
German universities is called his habilitation,
Yeah.
insinuating that at some point he may need to be rehabilitated.
Okay. Um, so I guess the root is the same, right? Rehabilitation means that you have lost some ability and you're getting it back. In this case, you are being given ability.
It's a special ability of mine.
I exactly. So you're going from, your doctoral studies to moving up to like a master of your craft kind of a thing. I didn't know it was called that. That's awesome. We should use that all the time.
Can you imagine being handed your diploma? Consider yourself habilitated.
Habilitated and then just weird look, and it's like move on next.
Anyway, his research was focused on defining all the normal flora of the infant intestinal tract, as
Okay.
well as its changes immediately after birth.
Okay. Yes.
Then, in order to do that, he had to assess the role of bacteria in digestion and physiology.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And once you've done that, then you relate it to pathologic conditions.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So way back before we used terms like microbiome, he was defining what would be fairly normal, I guess, the normal healthy microbiome of a tiny Austrian person, which is not the same as everybody the world around. Intestinal microflora can be quite diverse, but he was basically making a normalization, and this would have been really difficult, Josh. Modern culture methods already, we can sample a decent amount of stool, but these folks were, they were chemists and biochemists. They were starting from scratch, just trying to figure out how to properly culture things. And he was missing a whole host of other bacteria that hadn't been discovered yet and these kind of things. But he was doing his very best to show the most prominent culturable bacteria that would come out of healthy stool.
Now, the next part, I will admit, comes from Wikipedia, but it made me laugh, and it's
Okay.
very factual and serious. So,
Okay.
during his studies, he learned some very new basic techniques of pure culture and bacterial characterization from
Uh-huh.
Wilhelm Frobenius, a physician who had learned bacteriology from Robert Koch during
Uh-huh.
3 short visits to Koch's laboratory in Berlin. Koch's
Uh-huh.
test kitchen, if you will.
Yeah, there
Um,
you go.
but the next sentence makes all the difference.
Okay.
Frobenius made no other contributions to science.
Oh, it's so sad.
He existed,
Oh,
as far as Wikipedia is concerned, he
sure.
existed to pass on this technique to Escherich, who could make the real discoveries like a one-trick Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Oh, that's so sad.
So there were very few studies that, at least to this point, involved studying infant stool,
Yeah.
especially using these new bacterial methods that, while they're old hat for you, were cutting edge at the time. And he knew of only one study that did involve infant samples by a gentleman named Julius Uffelmann.
Uferman. Yes.
So, of course, you can imagine how popular he'd be when he's thrusting his hands at people. Look at this baby poop. Here, look. Can't you see? It's infected. It's got
Yeah.
things crawling all over it.
Yeah.
I mean, life of the party, this guy.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
I I think some of the coolest discoveries come from some of these folks who have these very niche interests.
and you're still picturing this as a Chipmunks episode, aren't you?
100,000%. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
I'm waiting for Dave to show up.
so Escherich demonstrated, because of course he thought about what the problem was with this approach, and demonstrated that meconium is sterile, and that intestinal colonization is from the environment, including breast milk, within the first 3 to 24 hours after birth. So he's like, look, this is not infectious, it's just sterile. And this bacteria, totally no risk to you. Still not getting a ton of party invitations.
No, absolutely. For those who don't have kids, or you're not in pediatrics, or you don't deal with poop on a regular basis,
Santosh, everybody deals with poop on a
yeah,
regular
I
basis.
know. If you're not dealing with newborn poop, how about that? So meconium, you're fetus, and then you're growing in the uterus like that. You're swallowing amniotic fluid, which is largely sterile. We now know from, deep sequencing, next generation sequencing, all that fun stuff, that there is actually, bacteria in there, but you're swallowing the amniotic fluid and then shedding a little bit of the intestinal lining. And that's just happening all the time up until you take, your first breath and you're out of there. But there's a mass of this stuff, and it is black and tarry. Interestingly, doesn't smell, right? Because it's sterile. And this black tarry first poop is called meconium. And you're absolutely right. Until the baby goes through the birth canal, because there is vaginal flora which colonizes the skin and the oral tract, and the baby swallows some of that. But then, you know, and then baby drinks from something, either formula or breast or whatever it is, and then the environmental bacteria gets in, and the microbiome, the baby microbiome, becomes established. And yeah, so that comparison was really important. But what that meant was that Uffelman had to sit there and wait for a newborn to have their first poo. This is back in the day when it was probably like he had to do a home invasion or two, Josh.
Even walking down the hospital or just poking your head around the corner. Hey,
Yeah.
what you doing there?
What should you? Is it he had a poop? Is you need that? I mean, if you're
You
not
know,
going to keep it, I can.
this may be why Germany has, shall we say, a reputation. Apologies to any of our German listeners.
Oh no, that's not offensive at all. Absolutely not. Yes. No, but this is really important data. Talking
So,
about,
all right, after demonstrating it was sterile and that it's all from the environment,
yes, the
s-
microbiome.
still working to improve his profile. He's like, maybe they just don't understand how many there are. He
Yes,
isolated 19 different bacteria. That's a lot
yes,
for one man to discover and
that's
add
yes.
to the infectious Pokedex.
No, absolutely. And these are, a lot of them are going to be brand new because people aren't going around poking around in a lot of poop yet, uh, especially infant poop. And that very, very new bacteria, which comes from, if they're breastfeeding, mom's nipple, the natural flora that's in the milk itself.
Or the next part of the story,
Yeah.
remember how we said he had only found one study by Julius Uffelmann?
Uffelmann. Yes, yes.
Well, with 19 bacteria, he beat the previous record set by Uffelmann of 2.
Oh, take that, Uffelmann.
Just completely destroyed. So to keep things fair, we're just going to mention 2 that he
Sure.
discovered.
Yes.
One was Bacterium lactis aerogenes, nowadays known as Klebsiella pneumonia,
Yeah, absolutely.
and the other was Bacterium coli commune, the common colon bacillus,
Yeah.
which now is Escherichia coli.
Yeah, yeah, actually named after him. So it sounds funny to say, but I know you're going to be saying this as you go to sleep tonight. It's Escherichia. So it's from Escheric, right? So it's Escherichia coli. Yeah, yeah. But he wasn't an arrogant person. He didn't named it after himself. He called it bacterium. And the reason he said Bacterium coli commune, because in Western Europe, and now in modern industrialized countries, especially in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe, this is the most common bacteria that you're going to get when you take out some stool spin it down, and then spread it out on a plate. It fully dominates the other bacteria in terms of sheer numbers. We now know, Josh, they're certainly not the most common, because the most common bacteria that are in there, the most abundant, you actually couldn't culture in Escherich's day because they didn't have the techniques.
He lectured in Munich with his 177-page postdoctoral thesis
Whoa.
as a monograph
Yeah.
entitled "The Intestinal Bacteria of the Infant and Their Relation to the Physiology of Digestion."
Awesome.
And he noted that the Bacterius coli was more likely to be an intestinal infection in infants and frequently could be isolated non-infectious from or frequently could be isolated from urine samples from young girls who were more likely to have UTIs, and
Right.
recognizing the significance of UTIs as a place to look for bacteria.
Yeah. So this was so cool. Found the bacteria, found out that, it's coming from the environment and then becomes enriched in the gut, and then says, "Hey, when it's in the intestine and person is healthy, this is a important bacteria. It helps participate in digestion and breaking down food. If it gets out of there and goes to a place where it's not supposed to go, i.e. the urinary tract, it'll cause pathology, it'll cause disease. Same bug, two different sides of the coin."
So essentially, we've moved from him being Theodore of the Chipmunks
Yeah.
to Hamilton of Bavaria.
Ooh,
You
there's
know,
a
he's
million bugs he hasn't seen. But just you wait.
but just you wait. And with that, we'll take a brief break. Tell you what,
Yeah.
if you're not in the middle of driving and listening to us, in which case, hey, thanks. Uh, but go to travelmedicinepodcast.com and sign up for our mailing list, and you'll get sent another plague direct to you. There's only we're actually running out of copies, which is kind of exciting.
Oh, sweet.
So get it while the getting's good, and we'll see you in a couple moments. And we're back. So why did Escherich always discover or science like he's running out of time?
Yeah.
Well,
I love it. Yeah.
he pioneered the use of X-rays as a diagnostic tool in children.
Oh, okay. So a little bit of a good thing, bad thing here, because at the time, Röntgen, also of German descent over here, it's you know X-rays were discovered, but probably they were a little overused. So,
He was a teacher, so who championed the importance of prevention.
mhm.
So he really focused on education both of his pupils, his colleagues, his community, and described idiopathic infantile tetany.
Oh,
In
okay, yes.
uh, and he also discovered what was later named, or initially named, Escherich's reflex, which you now know as the snout reflex.
Yeah, so this is what we have as little babies when we get close to the breast or the nipple in order to initiate feeding, sucking. There's a reflex where if you tap the lips, they pucker. You pout a little bit in anticipation of being able to get your meal. So this happens in little babies. Very, very important. And unfortunately, Josh, it is what's called a primordial reflex. It does show up when there are certain cortical strokes, which happen because it becomes, you become disinhibited, and these primordial reflexes come out, where, as adults, they should be extinguished.
Well, working with radiation and having a reflex named after you is enough to gain the notice
Okay.
of the ruling parties. And so he was named court counselor by Emperor Franz Joseph. And you know how he was habilitated? Well,
Yes.
the court counselor position name was Hofrat. So he was a habilitated Hofrat.
if if the emperor didn't
He
introduce
ain't
him.
nothing. He ain't nothing but a hoochie mama. A Hofrat. Hofrat. Bilete tucci mama.
Oh gosh, I'm sure Emperor Joseph probably introduced him that way all the time, like when he, introduced the court.
In 1919, they first suggested naming the bacteria after him as escherichia
Yeah.
coli. Huh.
So you say Esserich or Esserish, and then you put the E on the end. Esserichia, like
So
that.
maraschino cherry was was not officially sanctioned as the name until 1958.
Right. This is after, I think was it after he had passed away?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. All right. So I can't think of a higher honor. One of the most important parts of our microbiome, named after old Theodore Esserich.
I enjoy that we've had this conversation a bunch. What would you rather have named after you? A
Yeah.
disease
Yes.
or a treatment?
I see. I get to pick a different one because I am infectious disease. I would pick a microbe. Absolutely, because then it can be, it can be nice, it can be naughty, depending on what it does. And if it's a helpful microbe, all the better. But it doesn't have to be so black and white.
Now that we've talked about the discoverer, let's jump to the bug itself and start with Santosh. In case anyone on Earth is unfamiliar,
Yeah,
perhaps they recently acquired their microbiome.
sure.
What do
And also listening to they they got their microbiome and they're immediately listening to podcasts. Sure. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us what can you expect on average and on and off average with E. coli?
So, in terms of just being a part of your microbiome, it'll hang out if you have it in balance with the rest of the bacteria in your gut. So, for the Western world, firmicutes, there are other bacillus species. There should be a low amount of the Clostridia, right, like C. diff and those kind of things. But if it's all sitting in balance, then you should have a nice regular stool, not a lot of bloating, no intestinal pains or upset and that kind of thing. Josh, your very, very favorite, the Bristol stool scale. You should sit comfortably at a Bristol, 4 to 5, maybe occasionally a 6, but it should all be kind of hunky dory, this kind of a thing. And you know, if it's all sitting there like that, no problem at all. Now, if it gets, for instance, a young girl, because the distance from the gastrointestinal tract over to the urethra is so short, and the urethra is very short, and any kind of small complication, this E. coli can get into the bladder, it can cause a urinary tract infection. In vulnerable people, it can get into the bloodstream, such as those folks who are getting cancer chemotherapy, and you can get bacteremia, and our little babies, because they're colonized but their immune system isn't super strong yet. A small percentage, very rarely, thankfully, this E. coli will get into the bloodstream and sometimes even into the meninges and cause sepsis or meningitis or these kind of things. So it's a big deal in neonatal medicine, is E. coli. And then if
Now,
E. coli wants to stay in the gut, but it gets some bad plasmids, right? Some toxins and things like that, then it can give you the runs. It can cause a bad gastroenteritis. And that's what we're familiar with a lot of the time. One of the most common causes of the old traveler's diarrhea.
good old E-tech.
Yeah.
Now, when it's part of the microbiome, it's just part. It normally is in a biofilm with a bunch of other
Yes.
species, kind of like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
blob or the
Yeah.
river
Yeah.
of
Think of it
glowing
as a big,
sewage or the river of glowing sewage in Ghostbusters.
yeah, like a sheet of slime, just like.
And your personal E. coli, that's right, you home listener, typically includes a set of long-term residential squatters
Yep.
as well as short-term transients that vary depending on what you're eating, what your general health is, and what antibiotics you've been exposed to recently and in your lifetime. So, it's shed pretty often. They're the ones hanging in there are pretty tenacious.
Yeah, yeah. So just like you said, they're not all of the E. coli's are the same. So there's going to be the ones that are, residential. They have a physiology to the cell, which is a little bit more amoeboid. They're not quite as motile, right, moving around and that kind of a thing. And they help you digest. And then, say you have some vegetables or something like that, and you eat that, and you didn't maybe wash them all that well, now you can get a different E. coli hanging out on there. And if it's transient like that and it's not disease causing, no big deal. But if it's, for instance, that just like you said, Josh, that Shiga toxin producing E. coli, then it could imbalance everything, cause problems.
Now, it has to be pretty adaptable because not only does it live inside us, it can be found in pretty much every outside regional environment under much harsher conditions. And in
Yes.
order to do that, it had to form a diverse collective, a cabal, a sinister six kind of pathotypes that are associated with diarrhea. And it's ETEC, which is
Uh-huh.
enterotoxigenic. Then
Oh,
there's enteropathogenic, EPEC,
EPEC.
enteroaggregative,
Yak. Yeah.
enteroinvasive,
Mhm.
yike,
Yikes. Yike. Yeah.
and diffusely adherent, dick.
Uh,
Go ahead, Santosh. Read just the abbreviations down
yeah. I don't want
so we can
to.
all appreciate who named these.
It's just- I don't want to.
Now, the most dangerous of these was not mentioned, and that's the E157H7,
Yeah,
which is,
we call it 0158 0157H7. You
but
got
just in
so,
case, but we didn't want to lose out on that, alliterative nature.
yeah.
So it's also known as hemorrhagic.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the one that has uh, you know aside from other virulence factors, which makes it quite tenacious, it's picked up, the plasmid with the Shiga toxin on it. And, this is the one that can cause a horrible dysentery, right? Bloody diarrhea if it gets in. And in children, right, this is very much a pediatric disease. Uh, After the disease has gone through, the toxin seems to cause a almost like an autoimmune type of disorder afterwards called a hemolytic uremic syndrome, where your kidneys shut down and then you actually lose your platelets, and hemolysis happens also. The red blood cells burst, and it can be quite serious, although many children, kind of get through it. We don't have any good treatments for it. But it seems to be most of the time, thankfully, self-limiting. But yeah, that toxin that it acquired, it does wretched things to you. And Josh, I'm very sorry to say that we humans bred this bacteria by giving our livestock excess antibiotics.
That brings up the point that it can easily contaminate human food supplies,
Hmm.
uh, because cattle don't actually suffer from the disease. It's asymptomatic in them.
Yeah.
Now, it's not in any of their meat. They're safe to eat, but it can be transferred via fecal contamination in the butchering and packaging process, which is why.
Yeah, or they poop in the field, and the runoff that goes over the vegetables, for instance. So we've had it from spinach and ready-to-eat salads, the ones you get in the package. And if you don't wash those off properly before they get packaged, and then sometimes even after they get packaged, bean sprouts and spinach and stuff that you tend to eat fresh like that without cooking it, yeah, you can catch it that way too.
So the time between ingesting some version of E. coli and feeling sick is what we call the incubation period. And that's normally 3 to 4 days after exposure or within being exposed, but
Right.
could be as long as 10, as short as hours. Is that right, Santosh?
Yeah, it depends on whether it's a toxigenic strain. Toxins tend to act very, very quickly, and you just get hit, boom, like that. So usually, when I'm doing my medical history for a child, and we find a pathogenic E. coli, and we try to trace it, where did it come from? Especially if we're worried about an outbreak, is we'll trace back about a week and a half and say, hey, what did you eat? What did your parents eat? This kind of a thing. And oftentimes, somewhere in there, you can say, oh, kid came down with this diarrhea or whatever it was. But, dad was also sick, or mom was also sick, or brother or sister, or something like that. And you say, oh, what was the common food? And almost always, Josh, we'll find that somewhere 4 or 5 days back. But it's not always easy because you're right, that window can be a little bit broad. And if the child is the only one who's sick, then it's pretty hard to sometimes, trace down what exactly was the culprit.
Come on, Marty, we gotta go back to the poop to the
Yeah,
pooper.
to the yeah, it would have been a whole different movie, like a completely different. But no, that's what I do. I go back in time when I take my history and that kind of a thing. I like to think of myself more of like a Hercule Poirot rather than a Doc Brown. But
You know
go
what?
go.
So
Yeah,
did Escherich.
yeah, he did. He was a good epidemiologist, actually. He was.
So, for those of you worried, if your diarrhea lasts more than 3 days, or you have high fevers, blood in the stool, or so much vomiting you can't keep any food or liquids down,
Yeah.
uh, all good indications you should probably, at the very least, see an urgent care and likely may need admission to a hospital.
Yes. And honestly, if you have an intact immune system, you've all otherwise been a healthy person, the chances are you're going to be all right. And we just need to support your system until you're able to clear this out by getting you IV fluids and this kind of a thing. But yes, there can certainly be bad complications. And if you get to us sooner rather than later, we can help you out.
Now that we've terrified everybody with the dangers of E. coli,
Yeah, yeah.
let's let's give it some positives.
Yeah.
And in recent years, it's been used to make antibiotics,
Uh-huh.
to produce cancer fighting drugs, and even manufacture insulin, all because of the same plasmids that you told us so much about earlier.
Yeah, E. coli has a beautiful propensity to grab onto these small circular pieces of DNA. They also do. They pass them to each other, Josh, with these like little extensions of cytoplasm called a conjugation tube. Pass the DNA back and forth. But because they have an affinity to pick up genetic material and just basically use it. Think of them as, if you're a Star Wars fan, like a Jawa. Like, they'll just find scraps and put them together and do whatever they want. But you can exploit that, gather up some E. coli and say, hey, E. coli, I'm going to mutate you in a particular way so that, you're less harmful, and that we can control how you grow and what nutrients you need and what you're resistant to and not resistant to, so I can select you out. Okay. And then I'm going to feed you this plasmid, and you just make a ton of it for me, and you grow and you multiply nice and strong, and I'll give you some sugar and protein to work with. And Josh, they'll make a
And
beautiful
isn't
set
that
of.
all any of us really want,
Yeah,
Satosh?
it's
Just
true.
some sugar and protein.
And protein and some nucleic acids, and you assemble lots of plasmids for me. So now I have material to work with.
Well, it
Or I can induce you a little bit to take that plasmid material and make the protein that I want. Like an antigen or insulin. Any of this.
hey, I'll
Yeah.
induce you. Like like
Yeah.
researchers help to improve cancer drug Taxol.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
Now, before, the only source for the active ingredient in Taxol
Yes.
was from the Pacific yew tree, and it
Who tree?
required yew tree.
Me tree?
No, I
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
So the Pacific All right, Costello. S-
YEW, yew tree. Yeah.
and it required 2 to 4 fully grown trees for each patient, like those cartoons where it's whittled down to toothpicks,
Yeah, yeah. It's horrible. Yeah.
or the incredibly long and time consuming process of culturing new cells in the lab, because, they're still tree cells.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
But once you incorporate it into E. coli, you can churn those out very fast, which means you can get Taxol more frequently or more accessibly and
Yes.
ultimately cheaper, again, relatively speaking. Uh, Now, not only has it been used to help produce them, E. coli nowadays is being used to replace those kinds of medications entirely. As early as 2006, E. coli was taught to recognize cancer cells or high levels of cancer cells as an environmental change.
Mhm.
So, a laser trigger, essentially, which would
Yeah.
then prompt the bacteria to invade them. So, this was done at the University of California. Now, this is just a mechanism for getting into cancer cells.
Right,
It
right.
does not destroy them,
Okay. Yeah.
but it does give you a very effective delivery system.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. If you kind of program the E. coli to be enticed by the malignant cells and leave your healthy cells alone, then yeah, now you just load them up with whatever payload you want to and you send them hunting.
Of course, I think I'm still straying too close to the infectious theme. It's still
Okay.
attacking.
Yep.
Doesn't E. coli deserve to explore other alternatives?
Well, yeah. I mean, we talked about being a gene factory or a protein factory, but yeah, tell me,
But what about
do you
the
want
one who went to liberal arts college, Santosh?
to? He disappointed his parents.
That one,
Horribly. Sorry, the Indian just
due
came out.
due to fast reproduction and
What are you going to do with art? You know, are you going to?
so E. coli bacteria are frequently used in microbial art, which
Oh
is
yeah.
exactly what it sounds like. Microbe colonies grown to form pictures just by painting a petri dish with E. coli and letting it grow like, a chia pet that can cause horrible diarrhea.
Yeah. But so you can also use, just like we talked about, many different strains of E. coli and stuff, and you can give them plasmids where they'll make, glowing fluorescent protein, GFP, green fluorescent protein, and all this kind of thing. So you can make different colors, Josh, and all this kind of cool stuff.
We've got our industry, our medicine,
Yeah.
our artist.
Hmm.
Um, what other kinds of E. coli could there be? Well, over at Michigan State University, researchers have been observing the evolution of 12 isolated flasks for over 20 years.
Yeah.
That's it. They just walk into work each day, look at one of 12 test tubes, all of which are filled with E. coli. This sounds like an episode of The Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits.
Well, there is more to it than that. They, sequence out the genome, they look for what the mutations are and everything. But basically,
Oh, I'm
they're,
sorry. There's more to it than that. In 2010, they hit
yeah,
50,000 generations, and by
yeah,
then, one colony had already learned how to use citric acid as a carbon source when deprived of oxygen.
yeah. Yeah, these are E. coli by and large is aerobic, right? It uses oxygen as its an engine, the same way that we do in order to produce energy, ATP. But yeah, this one, gone and gone and gone, and flask number whatever, they got enough mutations and this kind of a thing that the molecular biology shifted and said, okay, well, if oxygen's around, I'll use it. But oh, you're going to try and choke me? Boom, vitamin C and break this down and make some ATP out of that. That's awesome. That is so cool. This, Josh, this one is watching evolution in action in real time, and it's amazing.
Like a couple millennium from now, the first E. coli vaguely
Yeah,
shaped blob is gonna burst out of the tube
yeah.
and, I don't know, join Starfleet.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's a beautiful closure. And I think
Yeah.
an excellent place to call this episode. So that's it for this week. We are down to our last month before we hit our season finale. There are only a few of the ebooks left. There are only a few of the 80 Plagues ebooks left. So sign up. It's
Yeah.
free. All you have to do is give us your email so we can send it to you. As always, we'd love to hear your comments, questions, and feedback. If you'd like to support us spiritually, emotionally, or financially, links to do that are in the show notes, along with links for further reading. This show is produced by me with a lot of help from Dr. Santhosh and friends. Our theme music is composed by Rachel Leisure. And until next time, keep a song in your heart, soap on your hands, a shot in your arm. No, seriously, wash your hands. You don't want this stuff on them.
Yeah, especially before you eat.
Yeah, before you touch anything, then spin a globe, pick a place to go, and after
Wash your
you
hands
do that,
again.
and after that, happy travels.
Bye, everybody.